You should be receiving an attestation survey within 1 week to attest that you attended this training. This is required in order to be assigned to a group. So if you are a volunteer curator that is interested in gene curation, this would apply to you. If you're a curator who already has a GCEP and you're just here to learn how to use the GCI, that's different. You've obviously already been assigned to a group. You will still need to attest to that you've done the training though. Once we have your attestation, we'll work to onboard you to a GCEP, Gene Curation Expert Panel, or you can start working with your GCEP that you are already volunteering for. And if you have any questions about this entire process, they should be directed to volunteer@clinicalgenome.org. Okay. Let's see. We're at 34 attendees. Annika, has it basically like reached steady state? I wasn't paying attention.
Yeah, just about. I think we're good to start.
Perfect. Let's get going. Feel free to stick questions in the chat. I can also pause at certain points or raise your hand and I can take questions. We'll also have some time for questions at the end. Okay, so this is the gene curation interface training. If you're here for something else, you're in the wrong place. So we also run quarterly other trainings of different curations. So I'm Marina DiStefano. I direct the ClinGen Biocuration Core based at the Broad Institute, and I'm here to present this for you on behalf of the ClinGen Community Curation C3 Working Group and the Education Coordination and Training ECT Working Group. Any questions, volunteer@clinicalgenome.org. You can email that. Okay, so for the agenda, I'm going to give you a GCI tutorial. This is entirely slide-based, and we'll pass around the slide deck after the call. This call is also being recorded, and you'll have access to that because this is a lot of information, I know. So, and then we'll also have time for questions about the GCI, about any of the other required training materials, and then also about the gene curation process in general. Okay, so this is kind of a little diagram of the gene curation process. So at first, when you join a gene curation expert panel, you'll receive an assignment. This could be just a gene, and they'll ask you to perform a pre-curation. This could be a gene and a disease and a mode of inheritance. It just depends on the work of your GCEP. Oftentimes, a GCEP will give one curator a pre-curation, and then they will also perform the full curation after that, but check in with your GCEP. So you'll receive an assignment. Usually this means that you would do a pre-curation. So this is lumping and splitting as needed, where you look for all the proposed entities to be related to your gene of interest. And you would present based on the training materials about the different pieces of information like the phenotypic spectrum, the mechanism of disease, the mode of inheritance, et cetera, on a call. And then the experts would help decide whether something should be lumped or split and which disease terms should be used for the curation. So all of this should take place with your experts either on a call or offline, so that you shouldn't have to just choose a disease on your own when you enter the gene curation interface. So this is performed, and then the full gene curation will happen. And at this point in time, you would enter evidence in the GCI, then you would save your curation as provisional, you would present it and review it with the expert panel, make necessary edits based on the discussion, save it as approved, and then it would get published to the ClinGen website. And we'll talk about more details of this process. So this is another diagram from the standard operating procedure of the gene curation workflow. It's a required gene curation workflow, and as a relatively new change, pre-curation, it's always been required, but it's now required to enter curations into the gene curation interface. So this information should be entered first into the gene tracker. You need to check in with your GCEP coordinator on who should be entering this information in the gene tracker. Some coordinators do all the information in the gene tracker, and some coordinators will assign curators a pre-curation, and then you would go in and fill out the information for your gene. So check in with your GCEP. It depends which workflow, depending on the GCEP. So the gene tracker and the pre-curation is required because now we also require the pre-curation IDs to link the gene tracker to the gene curation interface so that the pre-curation can be published to the ClinGen website when a gene curation is approved and finalized. And the GCI is the system of record for the gene curation, and this facilitates publishing this to the ClinGen website. So you'll see this is the workflow here where the pre-curation is done, and this is done in the gene tracker. It's then connected to the GCI. You will then curate genetic and experimental evidence, assess and score this evidence, and then get to a classification based on the score. Expert review will happen. The final classification will be approved with these edits and then be published to the ClinGen website along with the pre-curation information. So as I just said, pre-curations are published to the ClinGen website. The full pre-curation data is published at the time of the final gene disease validity curation. So until that time, this information won't be visible on the ClinGen website. There are some GCEPs that change their mind as to lumping and splitting as they really dive into a gene curation, and that's why we've made it this way. So the pre-curations will indicate OMIM phenotypes that were included and excluded from the curation. And if you are entering this pre-curation information based on your GCEP, please check for spelling mistakes or full sentences in the free text notes section, because this will be on our website and is used by the public. And just check in with your GCEP as to whether you have to do this. But this is a screenshot here of what a pre-curation would look like. So it will include the included MIM phenotypes that are all lumped together into this MED. So this is for MED12. So the disease name that the ID Autism GCEP chose was MED12 related intellectual disability syndrome. And you'll see that this includes these 3 MIM phenotypes here. Hopefully you can see my mouse, and an excluded MIM phenotype. It talks about the date that this was done, and then the curation type where there was a lumped entity for these 3 phenotypes here, and then PubMed IDs and the rationale why these were lumped together, and then some notes as to the outcome of the pre-curation. So this is all displayed just so that people can check our work and that our work can be as transparent as possible. And all of our gene curations are available on the website, and they are either available like sorted by GCEP or the entire list of genes, and then you can search them in the table and you see which SOP, which expert panel did it, which mode of inheritance, and when they were last evaluated. And this is all done through the gene curation interface. It's a web-based interface, and the URL is curation.clinicalgenome.org. This helps to document evidence supporting or refuting a given gene disease relationship, and it also allows for a group to work together through an affiliation-based system. This is a tool to also facilitate expert review, and that we have a PDF printing feature, and information should be saved and approved within the GCI to be displayed on the ClinGen website. That's the only way that we can publish it there. So before you begin with the GCI, you should know your resources. It was required that you review the gene curation SOP. We don't expect you to just memorize it. It's an extremely detailed SOP, very many pages. I often have it open while I'm doing curations. But so the SOP is on the website. There's also PowerPoint-based training modules to help you practice that hopefully you've had a chance to review. We do constantly update the SOP. We try to be reasonable. Usually it's once a year that we make substantial updates and change the versioning, but always go to the website for the most up-to-date version so that you aren't using an old one, for example. We also have help documentation for the gene curation interface, and this can be found in a drop-down menu in the interface, which I'll show you when we have screenshots. It's a help. So you would click it at the top right of the gene curation interface, and there's a drop down to go to the help document. And this will guide you a little bit through like the actual use of the GCI, not doing curations. If you have questions about how to score things, you should look in the standard operating procedure. And if you have any technical questions for the GCI, or if you think that something's behaving the way it shouldn't, you should email the Stanford help desk. Our Stanford ClinGen team is the one who maintains the GCI. So this is clingen-helpdesk@list.stanford.edu. And there is a little button in the help section to like contact help desk, so you don't have to remember this email. It pops that up for you. Okay, so the GCI is only accessible to members of a gene curation expert panel. The variant curation interface is publicly accessible. Both interfaces are connected. So when you create a login, you'll have access to both the variant curation interface, which if you want to play around in that, that's fine, and the gene curation interface. However, you won't be able to do gene curations until you're added to a GCEP. So the interfaces have a self-registering function. So you can go to curation.clinicalgenome.org. You would click the login button on the upper right. If it's your first GCEP that you've joined, you need to create an account and it will prompt you to follow the registration process. And please note that your email account is case sensitive. So just pay attention to that. And then this will send a registration request to the Stanford team that maintains this interface. And they're approved by Stanford every few days. I actually think they're much faster than that now. If it's something like you're about to be assigned a gene curation, hopefully it wouldn't be that quick of a turnover. But if you need to expedite your access, you would email the help desk once you finish registration, and they can validate it a little faster. But like I said, they're pretty fast. The box here is to create the account if you don't have an account there. There is also a demo site. And so this is kind of like a training playground, very critical to know that you cannot move anything from the demo site to the production site. So if you need to do an actual curation that's assigned, please don't do it in the demo site because we can't move it over and that will just cause you to repeat your work. So that's really much more of a training playground. And some GCEPs do have you practice within the demo site. So that's curation-test.clinicalgenome.org. If you already have GCI access, maybe you worked with another GCEP, and this is a second GCEP you're working on, or you've already registered, you still need to let your GCEP coordinator know because they need to request that you be added to their particular GCEP affiliation so that you can curate for their expert panel. As I mentioned, you can access both the gene and the variant curation interface with this account. So the test versus the production version, you'll see screenshots here. I try to not have both of these open within the same browser in different tabs because it's just confusing. I don't want to accidentally add information into the test site that I've been meaning to do in production and so on. So I really make sure that I only have one open at a time. And I really also try to make sure that I only have one tab open of the curation interface at a time because they can start to do funny things with saving under affiliations if you have multiple tabs open when you're doing things. There are certain things in the GCI that will open multiple tabs, but when I'm complete with whatever I need to do that opened another tab, I usually close back to that singular tab just to not have problems. So you'll see for the demo version, it has a big red banner at the top that says this is a demo version of the site, and we usually delete the site once a year. So this was cleared, I think, at the beginning of January. So now you pretty much have the entire year almost to work through practice examples in there. And then the production one does not have this banner along the top. Of note, affiliations need to be added separately to each interface. Both require a login, and unless you set the passwords to be the same, they will be different because the interfaces, the test and the production are not connected. They need separate registrations there. You don't necessarily have to be added to your affiliation in the test interface. We have a test affiliation so that you can practice gene curations because, like I said, you need to have an affiliation to do gene curations, but you don't necessarily have to have your GCEP's affiliation unless they want you to. Okay, so once you've registered and you contact your GCEP coordinator and they add you to the affiliation, when you sign in, the default is listed as no affiliation. So it will say welcome and your user and then no affiliation, pretty much in a big banner at the top. You are unable, you'll see that this is kind of like grayed out here. You're unable to do gene curations unless you're part of an affiliation, a gene curation expert panel. You can do variants on your own, but this is a requirement because there's only one record for each gene disease relationship, and we don't want people creating individual records and their individual affiliations. So you'll need to click the change affiliation button to go to your GCEP to do a gene curation. And then it will open up a drop down for you to choose your affiliation. If you just have one, it's just listed there. You would click on it, and then it would say welcome user and your affiliation. So you know that you're in the right spot. You'll see that the gene curation button is now available to be clicked. And then you'll also see your affiliation's entire gene disease records that can be searchable or filtered by status if you had started one or if you need to modify one. There are some gene curation expert panels and variant curation expert panels that share an affiliation. So there's a section for variant interpretations too. This is rare and new expert panels, but that you may see that. Try not to make random extra variant interpretations within your gene curation affiliation, please. And there's just arrows of all the things that I pointed out. If you need to, so this is a list of just your gene disease records and your GCEP, but if you need to look at all gene disease records for some reason, you can click this button and it's all gene disease records that are listed in the curation interface. However, you will only be able to edit the ones that were created and are listed under your affiliation. So this is really just for reference. Okay, so when you click the new gene curation button, you're going to need to include some required materials here. So the gene symbol is required, and this can just be the gene symbol, it doesn't need to be the ID. You can link out to get it if you need to, but your GCEP should be giving you that. If you have an old name, for example, it might throw an error for that. So you might need to go to HGNC and find the newer symbol. That would probably be the only error that you would get there. The mode of inheritance is required. It's a drop down. And then the disease is also required. And the adjective further describes the mode of inheritance. So, sex limited expression, like something like that. That's often not used because those are pretty rare scenarios. So the gene, the disease, and the mode of inheritance really should kind of be pre-selected based on your, well, given to you based on your pre-curation results. You should never be choosing them on the fly. And they're going to have to match what's going on in the gene tracker because you will put in a pre-curation ID and you can check with your GCEP coordinator for pre-curation ID retrieval, but this is the numeric ID for the gene pre-curation within the gene tracker. And so this information is going to be checked based on what's in the gene tracker and might throw an error if it doesn't match. So where are the gene curation, gene tracker pre-curation IDs that you need to include here? Either provided by your GCEP if you don't work within the gene tracker, or it's listed on the record here in this dashboard view, and it's here in the box. So for example, if you're going to curate PLN for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, you would use 45. Also, if you click into the record, it's listed along the top here. So that's required. So for selecting the disease, you want to confirm with your GCEP the proper term. It's strongly recommended that you select a term for the Mondo or the Monarch disease ontology. This is really important for linking and transferring the information on the back end and for displaying the information on our website. If the GCEP is lumping something and renaming a disease, as a last resort, you can use a free text term. However, this can't be published to the website, so this is really only a temporary fix while you enter your information into the GCI. So the combination of a gene, disease, and mode of inheritance is now a record. We have the ability to edit the disease in the GCI. And this is, if they're renaming a term, like I just said, and you put in a free text or we need to change the term for some reason. However, you cannot edit the gene or the mode of inheritance. So please make sure that you choose those carefully. You can only edit the disease. And you can't delete a record in your expert panel's affiliation. So the coordinator could work with you if something was done by mistake. The help desk can move a gene disease record to a parking lot to get it out of the affiliation to prevent confusion. But just really try to review the information before you create a record because you can only change the disease. So we use the ontology lookup system for searching the Monarch disease ontology. That being said, you probably will have your Mondo term before you go to the curation interface. So you often won't have to worry about this. But what you would need within a record. So if you search X-linked intellectual disability and you click into this record here, what you would need is the little orange tag here, and there's even a copy button. So that's what you would need for the GCI. So when you're given a Mondo disease term, it should be Mondo colon and then the number, and that all needs to go into the interface. And it will pull up the disease to have you confirm, and hopefully that was the one that you were looking for. If not, you can change it. There's a little pencil button here to edit the disease. But like I said, the gene can't be edited and the mode of inheritance can't be edited. So please just be careful with those. And then once you've created your gene disease record, you can start to add information here. So you would click add to start adding evidence via PubMed IDs. We are working to be able to make it so that you can add evidence from unpublished sources. So publicly available unpublished sources like preprints, for example, or ClinVar entries. As of right now, we do not have direct entry for those, and so we'd have to perform workarounds to detail that information, usually in the notes for change on classification at the very end. But you can check in with your expert panel about that. Okay, so if you enter the PubMed ID, it'll bring back the corresponding article. Make sure this is correct here, and then click so you would enter the PubMed ID, click retrieve. It will give you this piece of information here, and when that's correct, you can click add article. Unfortunately, this is another thing that cannot be deleted or edited. So if you add an article by mistake, it kind of just has to sit there. We can't delete it. So just try to make sure that you're adding correct articles. You can also click that an article doesn't have scoreable evidence or something to kind of move it to the side, but just try to be cautious with that. Once a PubMed ID is entered, you can add notes or evidence. So we will make a record of what is the earliest report of a gene disease relationship in humans so that we can look at the replication over time, because strong and definitive are the same scoring, but definitive has replication over time. And so while the interface isn't intelligent enough to know the difference between strong and definitive, it can at least prompt you when by showing you the article that you note is the earliest report of a variant in the gene causing disease. So when you add the paper, you'll see here that there are sections for non-scorable evidence. So you could click that if you had something that you didn't end up scoring, if you had other comments for the PubMed ID. But what can be also clicked is this is the earliest report of a variant in the gene causing the disease in humans. And so it can remind you when the clock starts for replication over time. So you'd want to check this if it's the first report, and then just click save. And that will be marked off in the interface. And here are all the pieces of information on the side. So you can start to add genetic evidence or experimental evidence by hitting the little pluses. And once you've started to add things, you can edit them. And so we'll talk through, and then below this is also experimental evidence, but we'll talk through first adding genetic evidence. So entering genetic evidence, there are multiple levels that genetic evidence can be entered as. So the highest level, and think about this as kind of like the largest group of individuals, because we have copy buttons for demographic information. So you can enter a group. And you might want to use this when there are many probands with similar characteristics in a single paper, because you only have to enter certain pieces of information once. So the origin or the ethnicity of the group, if it's simple enough to enter, you could add that. Their type of testing, which is potentially more useful, and that can be copied for every single individual with a little copy button. Phenotypic features, you can list all the HPO terms for the group and then copy them over to each individual, which will really save you time in data entry. So I will usually use the group button when I have potentially at least 3 or more probands that would have the same information, that it would make it worth my while to add this information. If you have 5 or more, you should definitely use the group function, because you can also add family members within a group too. It doesn't just have to be singletons. So you can consider adding the group, and then this would be hit the plus button for group. And then the next level of granularity is a family. And you want to use this when you want to document specifics about multiple family members. And you have to use this if you want to score segregation information. So you only ever score the variant level evidence in the proband. But then if you have a family, you can score segregations to kind of give more points to that family. So in theory, you could create a group with all the pieces of information within it, and then you can create a family within that group, it would ask you. And if you have just a bunch of singletons, you could just create an individual. So you would only want to use this when you want to report a single proband. If you have segregation information, you would always want to add a family, because then it will ask you, do you want to add a proband? And then you can add the proband to the family. Variant level evidence, like I just said, can only be scored on an individual. So you could start with a group, document all the information, but then you need to further document individuals because we score on a proband basis. Since individual is the main type of page for scoring purposes, we'll review its components first, because the other tabs have very similar information. So for entering an individual, some fields are required. So the label is required. And you really need to use identifiers that will help you remember like what individual that was. And you also want to use identifiers that are different across papers, because if you label everyone like individual one and one paper, individual one and another paper, individual one and a third paper, the interface will group them all incorrectly and try to score them together, and it throws an error. So most of the time I'll do the author underscore whatever the label of the proband is. Sometimes they give you an actual label for the proband, and you can use that if it's a published one. But I often will include the author first, the first author, and underscore, and then label the individual, just so that the interface doesn't get confused with generic labels. And you can use any identifiers that the authors use for the family too, if you're including individuals with segregations and adding things in the free text. You have to answer the question, is the individual a proband? And you need to answer yes if you intend to count this person in your scoring. You need to include the disease for the individual, and you usually can select copy from the gene disease record for this. And then the sex is also required. There is an option for not provided or unknown, so that's okay if it's like a giant cohort paper and you don't have that information. The page will not save if these fields are not entered. So these are required. So other fields are not required, but they populate a summary that can be used to facilitate expert review, and experts might ask you about them. So for the pieces of information that are not required, the variant type and the variant are technically not required, but if you want to score an individual, you need to include the variant and the variant type. You can also include the age and ethnicity, and then proband phenotypes. There's a free text field or an HPO field. I think most GCEPs do suggest that you use HPO terms for granularity. Segregation information. This is the number of affecteds, unaffecteds. If there's a published LOD score, there's a location for that. This information is entered on a family page. If there's any previous testing on the proband, you can include this in free text. And experts will often ask about this, so it can be helpful to include it. And then how are they tested? There are choices in a dropdown, and then it will assign points based on the type of variant that you've chosen. And if you want to go with those default points, you would go with those default points. And if not, you would modify the points, and then it's required to provide a reason why you've changed the points. So it's best practice to enter information in these fields when available. But check with your GCEP regarding the types of information they want entered. So for example, I've worked with the hearing loss expert panel for a very long time. They often really want to know if a proband has been tested for GJB2, which is the most common genetic cause of hearing loss. And they'll ask that if it's not listed in the information. So that's something that we would be on the lookout for curators. So things like that. It's a good question. So question is, does previous testing only refer to genetic testing, or does it also include laboratory testing? Most of the time, I would say it includes genetic testing, but individual or depending on your GCEP, they might want other pieces of information, other types of testing included. So you can ask them for that. Maybe there's some sort of transfer analysis, like different blood chemical analyses that people might want. And arrays, of course, but that's genetic. Okay, so while not required, some fields are necessary to enable scoring. At a minimum, you have to enter a variant and choose the type of variant so that it can provide a suggested score. So to enter a variant, you need an identifier so that we can pull up a standard piece of a variant nomenclature. And so you'll need either a ClinVar variation ID or an allele registry ID. So if your variant is present in ClinVar, it's a little simpler. So you can go to ClinVar, you can find your variant. The variation ID is boxed right here. It's also present in the URL, usually on the top. And so this you would paste directly within the interface to pull up your variant. If your variant is not published in ClinVar, you may need to register it within the allele registry, and the link for that is reg.clinicalgenome.org. And this is nice because you can search for your variant in a variety of formats, including HGVS, your Nomad ID, and even if you have a really old paper and you don't have the HGVS, you can try to generate the proper HGVS using a fuzzy search query. So pretty much right here. If you don't have a transcript or HGVS, you can do a gene and variation-based query or interactively generate the variation. So that can really help out with those old papers. There is an explanatory video on how to use the allele registry at the reg.clinicalgenome.org on the front page. So let's say we use HGVS nomenclature to search for our variant. The nice thing is the allele registry folks at Baylor have registered pretty much every variant in Nomad and every variant in ClinVar. So oftentimes the variant is already listed in the allele registry, and you can just pull this canonical allele identifier, CA, and a string of numbers. This is what you would need. If something is not registered, you just have to register it yourself right there on the fly. You will need to create a login to do an allele registry registration, but that, just like a gene curation interface login, you can just do right there, and you don't need approval for that. You just log in. It doesn't track your information. It won't say like Marina registered this variant. It's just kind of to track usage. Okay, so once a variant's entered, you'll see the preferred title here, which is like pretty similar to the ClinVar HGVS most of the time, and a link out to ClinVar if you need it. If you want to see additional information about this variant, you can view the variant in the variant curation interface. Like I said, this is the VCI and the GCI are connected. So if you want to see frequencies from Nomad, for example, you can click this button. If you want to see computational predictors, we have Rebel in the variant curation interface. And a range of other predictors. You can just click this button. It will take you over to the variant curation interface to be able to rapidly review your variant of interest. So this, you'll notice, is the genetic evidence summary matrix. From version 8 of the SOP, we're at 10 now, if I remember correctly. We have made changes. Instead of scoring at the proband level, even though you are scoring a proband, you enter the variance and it adds together the variance to give you the total score. So you could either have a predicted or proven null variant, which suggests at 1.5 points you would start, or an other variant type. This is usually a missense or a non-canonical splice, for example, something like that. Oftentimes you would want to have a suspicious variant if you're scoring here. Check in with your GCEP what that means. It might just be rarity in Nomad and potentially a damaging score for computational predictors, but each GCEP has their own requirements. If there's functional data, you can add points, and if it's de novo, you add more points, and this gives you a scoring range per variant, which then, if you have a biallelic observation, because it's autosomal recessive, would get combined for a proband level score. And so you pretty much need to answer this information that I just talked you through so that it can suggest a point scoring for you. So what's the type of variant? And the options are predicted or proven null and other. Is the variant de novo? So it knows to add points or not. If yes, is the variant maternity and paternity confirmed? Just to remind everyone, the variant should also always be confirmed to be de novo and that the parents have been sequenced and it's not present in the parents. However, it's not necessarily required that the parents be confirmed that they truly are the parents. And you would be able to answer this question based on the type of testing that's done. So if it was just a Sanger confirmation where you're just looking for your variant of interest in the parents, that's not enough information to give maternity and paternity. However, if you have triome, exome, or genome sequencing, that's going to look at enough sites to be able to legitimately tell maternity and paternity. So you can answer this question appropriately. It's not required because if the variant's not de novo, you don't need to answer that. Then also you're going to answer the question, is there functional data to suggest if it's going to add even more points? If yes, it's a requirement. You have to describe the functional data. This will be displayed on the website. So keep that in mind. Pretty much everything in the curation interface is now displayed on the website. So just check for typos. Try to use descriptive instead of just like little fragmented notes, descriptive sentences so that people can check our work. And then you would select the status. So for the selection of the status, if you want to score it, you need to choose score. If you're not sure about it and you want to flag it, you can choose review if you want to check in with the experts. But then you would have to come back and edit this again to score if they were like, oh, yes, let's score this. If you choose contradicts, it's going to list at the end of your curation that you have contradictory evidence. And you can have different pieces of contradictory evidence and still end up with a legitimate gene disease relationship. But always check in with your experts about this. So the default score is calculated based on your answers to the required questions. If this score is not the score that a GCEP wishes to use based on their SOP, you would want to adjust it. So select a score different from the default score here, and then you would change it. However, if you do that, it is required to include an explanation, and this will be publicly displayed now, actually, not just in the future. So use complete sentences. And then any changes you make will populate this area. So you can see no for functional data, no de novo. It's a predicted proven null, and it suggests a 1.5 score. Okay, so then we'll move on to a family. If you have, and I should say you enter a family first and you would score proband, but we just started by talking about the proband level information because a lot of it's the same. So if you have scorable segregation data, you want to start by entering a family. The required fields for a family are similar to a proband. You have to have a label. Similar to the proband label, you would never want to make it generic because then that can cause confusion when the interface aggregates things. So oftentimes I will list the first author's last name underscore the family. If there's a published family label, you can use that too. Just make sure that it's unique enough. And then what also is required is the number of affected individuals with the genotype. The page will not save without this information entered. Just like for the individual level information, while not required, some fields are necessary to enable scoring. At a minimum, you must associate a variant to a proband. So if you go from the family information, it will prompt you about information in the family, but then you also will have to go to the individual level page to add a proband to be able to score a proband. So you can start this process on the family page. Questions about the proband will appear there. It will ask, do you have a proband to score? The proband has to have an associated disease. To simply copy the overall record, first you hit the copy button to the family, and then you hit the copy button to the individual, the proband. And when you save, you'll be prompted to add additional information on the proband that's required for scoring, which we talked about already. So for family specifics for segregation, there is information required for segregation scoring that should be entered on the family page, and those pieces of information that have an asterisk are required. So it will ask you the number of affected individuals with the genotype and a couple other pieces of information that are not necessarily required. I think So it will ask unaffected individuals for recessive calculations, number of segregations, if you want to include that. Were there any inconsistent segregations? To be fully transparent, oftentimes you wouldn't want to score a family if that happens. And an explanation if you choose yes. And you can mark if a family is consanguineous, and if you want to include where the family was located in a publication, like a figure, you can include that there. What also you should include if they have it is a published LOD score, because per the SOP, the published LOD score is something that we would use first instead of calculating our own using the calculator in the GCI. And so you would include that published LOD score here, and then it will ask you if you should include this in the calculation. And there are some size requirements for families, and I think I have screenshots of little breadcrumbs that will remind you. The interface is not intelligent enough, unfortunately, to tell you, oh, this family, based on the information you gave me, is too small to score, but we at least give you little info buttons to remind you if a family is too small to score or not. Okay, so I just detailed all of that. Another thing that you need to include is the sequencing method. So this will affect how we calculate the segregation score. So you can either choose candidate gene or exome genome, all genes in the linkage region sequenced, and you would get more points for this latter type of sequencing compared to candidate gene because you've just looked at your gene of interest. So this is the information that I just mentioned. It won't tell you whether a family automatically, whether a family is too large or too small. It's not too large, I guess, just too small. So it says for X-linked and autosomal dominant conditions, only include families with 4 or more segregations in the final calculation. For autosomal recessive, include families with at least 3 affected individuals. So that will remind you if your family is large enough to include in the final calculation, and then you can choose yes or no based on this. For autosomal recessive conditions, you have the same pieces of information that I just walked through. Okay, so once you've added that segregation information for a family, then you would be prompted to score or add information about a proband to be able to score the proband, and that will take you to the individual page that we just reviewed earlier. The same fields are required for scoring. So it's just starting at a higher level with the family to be able to add segregation, and then you would add the proband the same way you would with a singleton. Okay, so if you enter a group first, which is the highest level that you can go, you would want to use this, like I said, when you're trying to enter many individuals with similar characteristics. There are some required fields. They're similar to the family and the individual fields. So the group label, that's for your own identification purposes. It's unlikely that you're going to have a ton of groups across papers, but you might want to make this one unique too with an underscore in a group. The total number of individuals in your group is also required. When you save, you'll be asked if any of these individuals have family information. If you say yes, then it would take you to the family page that we just talked through. If you say no, you'll be asked to enter the associated individuals, and you would go to an individual level page to be able to score probands. So this is just a screenshot here. Do any of the probands or other individuals have family information? You'd say no, maybe if you had a bunch of singletons. And then you can add new individuals for this group or return to the curation page and add them later. But to be able to score, you would have to add the individuals. So why the group is convenient, which is what I've said previously, is when you add information to the group, you can copy it to every single person within the group. And so it saves you time. So you can add, so let's say you have a multi-system phenotype or a syndromic phenotype that has, I don't know, 12 different features. You can add those all at the group level, and then when you go to the proband, you can remove certain features from a particular individual if they didn't display all of those features. But it's helpful to add every single phenotypic feature that's possible within that paper to the group level so that you can pick and choose for each proband, because there might be probands that have all of those features. So it saves you time to add them all at the group level and then just be able to copy them. If you enter free text, that also gets copied to the individual level if you hit the copy button. So it's a convenient feature of the group. And this is just what it looks like. You would click here to copy the terms to the individual record, and you can add or remove terms that don't apply. And it's also available for demographics and methods. So very, very time saving if you have a lot of singletons that have similar methods because they're from one paper. Okay, so the last piece of genetic evidence that you would enter potentially, and I would say most people don't run into this, but it's a case control. So you would click add case control and then similar questions to the individual page, but for both for cases and controls. And there are fields that are unique to the case controls. Often these are free text fields to comment on the power and the statistics and the bias. And see the SOP for this information. But you'll also have the ability to indicate score, contradictory evidence, or review for a case control. But much of that really is free text. Okay, so we're moving on to experimental evidence. You would click here to add experimental data. It's pretty much below the add genetic evidence on the far right of the interface. And then you can select the category of experimental evidence you'd like to document. And it's all, we have little short descriptions for all of them there. And then document your experimental evidence as outlined in the SOP. Some categories have subcategories. So here's an example for biochemical function. You then need to choose A or B, and it gives a little description. And then you have both the option of using ontology terms or free text within the experimental evidence entry. One of them is required, but not both, and it doesn't matter which one you use. You can check with your expert panel. I would say most of my expert panel use free text descriptions here. And then certain experimental fields are pulled through to the evidence summary to document at the end. So really be sure to type the summary you want the experts to review in the boxes. And I'll leave this here and you'll get these slides at the end. So other notes, some experimental evidence types allow you to associate a variant. That's optional. You can imagine for functional alteration patient cells, if they or non-patient cells, if they transfected a variant into HeLa cells, for example, you might want to add that variant into there, but it's optional. Anytime you decide to change the score from the default, just like with genetic evidence, you'll be required to provide a reason, and this will be displayed on the evidence summary. When you're finished entering all of your evidence and ready for expert review, click Classification Matrix at the top right and View Classification Summary. And then you'll see your scoring. I like to go to this page like every so often during my curations and make sure the math that I'm thinking in my head is adding up and that I didn't forget to add a piece of information. Your calculated classification will be at the bottom of the page. As I mentioned, it's not smart enough to tell you if something's replicated over time, but it will show you the PubMed ID that you indicated was the first one and the year for it. So you can choose what replication over time is. There's a little info button to remind you what it is. If you scored anything as contradicts, it will be noted here in the contradictory evidence, and it's separated by genetic and experimental, and it would just say yes if you chose something that contradicted. If you need to modify the overall score, because let's say you have ClinVar entries that you couldn't score, you would click this to modify to something else, and then you need to add information here. So if you're scoring ClinVar entries, your GSEP can help you with this. You would detail these entries and the reasons for change. The evidence summary is required, and we have standard evidence summary text to give you as an example to work through, and then you'd click Save. And the template language can be found on our website, and really it's displayed on the website and many people use it, so make sure to check your spelling and grammar. When you're ready for expert review, you would save something as provisional, and then you would need to preview it and submit it. So question for a strong to definitive upgrade, is it a separate curation for the new probands, or are you updating the original curation? So you would just click the replication over time and it automatically shifts it to definitive because the score is the same. It's just the interface can't tell you whether something has been replicated over time. So it's just something that you need to add yourself. It doesn't do anything to the record. It just shifts it automatically, and you don't need to include any rationale for that. It's just, it doesn't know the difference. That's why we provide the little breadcrumb to remind you. Okay, so at this point, you're ready for expert review. It's typically a full review on a call. And if it's something straightforward, if it's a really definitive gene, it might be done offline via an email review. The information you entered in the GCI can be used to create an evidence summary table to facilitate review, particularly the offline review. Check in with your GCEP how they present. Some people use PowerPoint, some people use the PDFs. If you want to use the PDF, you would click Preview Evidence Scored. You can click the little link here if you need to look at the evidence table without a preview watermark. But if you're previewing something that hasn't been approved yet, you would click Preview Evidence Scored, and then it will take you to this evidence summary table where it shows every proband that you've scored and the functional data explanation if you've included that, or if you've upgraded or downgraded something, included that. Something that is a newish feature is if you see something here, if you go to the summary and you're like, oh, there's a typo in the functional data explanation, these are actually clickable links. And so it will take you back to the proband so that you can edit this functional data explanation, because before you had to just exit out of this and go dig around in the interface to try and find this one again to be able to edit it. So we tried to make that convenient for you. So you can use the link to generate the summary for expert review, provisional summary here. And you have the very nice evidence summary text. You have the matrix right here, and then you have the additional pieces of information down here. And it provides instructions for best PDF printing. So landscape for layout, 50% for scale, minimum for margin, select background graphics, and then you can print the PDF and save it and then send it along to experts if you're offline reviewing or show it on a call. So for expert review, your creation will be reviewed and approved by the group. You are responsible for making any changes to your entry that are recommended. Others in your affiliation are able to view and edit your work, but you should assume that you need to make the changes after a presentation. So when you do this, you just have to go in and make all the edits, but then you'll have to save another provisional and then eventually save an approved if that's what a curator does in your GCEP. Because you can imagine a provisional classification is just a snapshot in time. So if you make changes, you need to resave this again so that the snapshot is corrected. So to make edits after a record is saved as provisional, you would just edit the evidence using the edit function next to each piece of evidence. And then when you're ready, you would go to the view classification summary. And then from there, you can edit the evidence summary paragraph if they suggested changes for that. And then we would repeat the same process, save, preview as provisional, and submit provisional. And if your GCEP has curators approve and publish curations, check in with them. You can do that. So after you've made any edits requested after group review, you would approve the classification. Just as with provisional, to approve, you have to preview it and then submit it. Something that's really critical is if you don't edit this date that's approved, it will just default to today's date. And oftentimes you have to backdate this because it might take a while to get into the interface. So make sure that you double check that this date is correct, because we use this for our recuration calculations. And then also people will look at the curation dates on the website and say, hey, this paper was published and you didn't notice it. And that's just because you accidentally let it default to today's date, for example. The GCI also supports multiple contributors. So if multiple GCEPs work together on a curation, they can be acknowledged in the interface, and this will actually display on the website too. You'll see, for example, the antibody deficiencies GCEP has primary curations and secondary curations. So oftentimes for it to be a secondary contributor, a GCEP just reviews an evidence summary and makes sure they agree with the final decisions there. And so you can click acknowledge other contributors when you're at the approval stage there. And you would choose in the drop-down classification contributors to acknowledge other GCEPs. Don't choose anything in the classification improver unless it's for some reason you didn't approve the classification, but this is pretty rare. So you would only ever acknowledge other curators here. And then one last thing that's required now is choosing a curation reason, because we've added semantic versioning. So you'll have info buttons for all of it, but a new curation, and then a bunch of options for recurations, and then administrative updates if there was a typo, for example. And so this is required to publish something, and this will help us version the curation. So for example, if it's a new curation, it's 1.0. And depending on the type of recuration, it would be a minor versus 1.1 versus 2.0, for example. And this is the help doc here. So if you click the help menu up here, it will take you to the help doc, and there's more information about the curation reasons there too, if you need it. And then this is how it's displayed on the website. And all the information is now displayed. So you really just want to make sure that there are no typos within your text, because it's all available now on the website. And you can get CMEs for your gene curations. I use gene curations myself to get quite a bit of CMEs, and you can receive up to 10 hours of CMEs per curation, and you can submit up to 10 curations per year. So you can get to your amount of required CMEs or CEUs potentially just by doing gene curations. And there are instructions for that. It has to be within the calendar year. So if you're collecting CMEs or CEUs, please do it within your calendar year. Okay, so next steps, make sure your full name is displaying in the attendee list, and we'll record your training. You're going to attest to your training, and this will get sent to you an automated email with a link to say that I attended this training. Check your junk or spam or quarantine for volunteer@clinicalgenome.org if you haven't heard anything in a while. And once we receive your attestation, a coordinator will work to place you in a GCEP if you are not already a GCEP volunteer. And then you'll also get a training certificate. Okay, so I know that left maybe only 2 minutes. So these are places for questions. If you have questions about your role, questions about the GCI, and general questions about ClinGen, and if in doubt, use the general ClinGen questions. We'll forward to the correct group. So with that, I think I have like a minute or two for questions. So I will open it up for questions. Feel free to stick them in the chat or unmute. You'll get this recording and the slides afterwards. I know that was a lot to throw at you, but happy to answer any questions.
Got a question. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes. Yep, I can hear.
Yeah, I was wondering for the segregation, if you have a family that has, 4 individuals segregating the variant and the phenotype, and then you have several individuals of an appropriate age that have the variant, don't have the phenotype, and you would expect them to. How do you weigh that? Do you just not count that family, or do you not count those individuals, or what?
It's a good question. So I think it does depend, and you kind of hinted to that, on your disease and what your GCEP is thinking. I would say in general, people tend to count non-segregations as affected individuals that don't have the variant, because you can be sure that then that's not causing your disease in your family, unless it's like a phenocopy, for example. If it's a really early onset, really severe condition, that's pretty good evidence of non-segregation, I guess, because likely that they have it. So check in with your GCEP. I would say in general, if you're suspicious like that it might not be causing disease, or maybe there's reduced penetrance, something going on, I often will not score and then check in with the GCEP. If they want to score it, they can score it. But of course, the caveats there.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I don't want to hold you too long. That was already 90 minutes. So thank you for attending the training. We'll be following up with your attestations. And if you have any questions as you go, feel free to email those email addresses. And thank you for your time. And thank you for volunteering for ClinGen. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.